Dr. McIntire, could you tell us how you became interested in psychology and how that directed you to the study of becoming a behavior analyst?
Yes, can I go back a long ways?
You may.
Yeah, can I go back a long ways? When I went to Northwestern, which is where I started my undergraduate education in psychology, I had spent 2 years in downtown Chicago high school, and then downtown Chicago colleges, I guess, but I didn't use much of that credit when I went to Northwestern. And I came across an advisor who said to me, "You're a junior." And I said, "Well, I'm a junior in that I've been in school for a few years, but I'm not a junior in the sense I just came to Northwestern, so I'm new here. I'm a freshman here." "Well, you're a junior, and juniors have to have a major. What's your major?" And I said, "Well, that's a question. That's a problem because I haven't really thought this through very well. I've been majoring in chemistry, but I don't want to do that anymore, and I'm looking for something else." And so this lady happened to be Janet Taylor, and as some of you probably know, is quite a famous psychologist in her own right. Matter of fact, she was president of APA eventually. This was way before she got to that job. But she was a take charge sort of person, Well, you're going to do this, And she pushes over to me a whole bunch of catalogs and stuff and says, "Sit here and pick out a major. You can change it later, but you have to pick out a major right now. Sit down and do it." So I'm looking at these cards, the IBM cards in those days. And there were a place on the IBM card that had to be filled in with your major, written in on the IBM card. And so I'm looking at this stuff. I'm 19 years old, so I don't really care what I put down. I just want out of the situation. And Dick Sorogas, who became a friend of mine later, also came in. He was a graduate student for Dr. Taylor. And he puts the cards down and he leans across the table like this to talk to her about something I didn't understand. And I'm sitting there looking in under his armpit. This is a true story. Looking under his armpit. He's got it filled in where I'm supposed to have this thing filled in. P-S-Y-C-H-O-L-O-G. This is a funny word. I couldn't pronounce it. Let alone I'd know what it was. I couldn't pronounce it. And I knew I couldn't pronounce it. And when Dick Sorogas left, so what I did, I just shoved his stuff back across the table and I said, "This is what I want to do." And she looks at it, and of course she's a famous psychologist, and I didn't know that either. And she says, "Well, that's wonderful." And she says, "Dr. McIntire, I don't even know my language. Roger, could I make a suggestion about this?" And I said, "Yeah. Why don't you take a course in it?" "Oh, yeah, all right. I could take a course in it." And so I took a course. And the course I took was, Psych 100, and it was from Brendan Marr, who turns out to also be a very famous psychologist years after that. And I blundered into some really lucky people. And I started there. He was not a behaviorist. He was a clinical psychologist looking mostly at brain function. And I ended up assisting him in his lab next year, and then I ended up following him to Louisiana State the next year and being his lab assistant. And I got interested in the work he was doing in training the animals to look at brain function. You train them to do something like, a color discrimination task or something. And then he's looking at what would disrupt the color discrimination task, that is, what events in the brain would disrupt it. So I was interested in the preliminary stuff, the teaching of the animal to do the task in the first place. And so I went off in that direction a little bit, and that in years to come became known as behavior analysis. Not by me, but I mean other people.
That, if I just remember, I think that led you into experimental psychology.
Experimental.
And that is the foundation for behavior analysis?
In those days it was. Experimental psychology was the field. I mean, if you went around to graduate schools in the 1950s, there were a couple common things. Clinical psychology, you could do a graduate doctorate in clinical psychology. Experimental psychology and industrial psychology. Those were the three. There were others, and of course now we've really flowered out into a lot of different kinds of degrees. But those were the three kinds of degrees that were most prevalent. And I was in experimental, and what that meant basically was learning and perception. So there were experiments in perception, you know, how people see funny illusions and stuff like that. You can tell from what I said that it wasn't something of my interest. And then learning and how animal behavior changed. And you know, I changed instantly when somebody told me that learning was a change in behavior due to practice. When I heard that sentence, it clicked, because learning wasn't a thing in the brain where you learn something. It was a change in behavior, that what you're doing due to practice. Once I got that, I thought, you know, I can study this. So that's what I did.
Well, how would you take your work and your education and how would you say that was applied to behavior analysis here in the 21st century? What would you say with your graduate work, your work in experimental, your work as parents, and learning, how that brings us to the 21st century that you would like to be remembered for?
Oh, what I don't know what I would be remembered for. I think what happened was that there was a time in I would say it was about the early 1960s, when the principles that were being demonstrated in animal work with pigeons and rats and dogs and stuff like that. I think people always knew this, but they all of a sudden turned their attention to the notion that you could apply the principles to this other animal we had, the human being, and that would work. I think up to then they were intimidated by that, because they thought, well, you know, the thing is, you know, people have cognitive processing and stuff, and it's not the same thing as just you know, the black box stimulus response stuff. That's not right for the human. And we said, well, there's a lot of people came to the conclusion, yes, it is right for the human. There may be other things, and of course now we have what we call cognitive behavioral and so forth. But you can look at that one piece and you say, well, wait a minute, you can actually show that there are a lot of principles in the animal work that apply to human beings, even granting the notion that human beings certainly have other processes going on that we're not quite studying, or we never have understood, and that are yet to be studied by other people who are coming along later. But that was a crucial event about 1962. 62 was when I got my degree, and of course I got my degree in animal learning and in animal surgery. And right about then, people like Joe Brady, who saved my tail on many occasions by getting me a grant to keep my laboratory going. So I'll give him some credit. Don Pomeroy, who was in clinical psychology and working with mainly school psychology, but he was looking at school psychology from his PhD was from Iowa with Ken Spence and those people in essentially just before me in the 1950s, and he was applying his, you might say, mentality of looking at a child and saying, well, why would he do that? And then reaching conclusions that had to do with the events that were occurring there, not speculations of what was going on in the kid's brain, which he couldn't get to anyway, but looking at what he could get to, which was the kid did this, and then the mommy did this, and then his sister did that, and that must be where it's happening. And Don was something like that. Leo Walder's another one that did the same thing. Both of those guys were clinical psychologists. They weren't experimental psychologists, but they had they had a good grounding. One reason they did was because they were both bumping up against Joe Brady all the time. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like we went from experimental clinical psychology to behavior analysis. Is that what happened, or how do you see behavior analysis, how it has changed over the years and where it is now in the 21st century?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that happened that made it behavior analysis, and there are probably people out there who would like to disagree with me, but I'm here and I'm going to give my opinion, is that we sort of put aside classical conditioning. We put all the Volpe stuff and the counter conditioning and also all that became a separate branch of the tree, so to speak, because Skinner didn't like it. That's, I think, really the reason. B.F. Skinner did not like it. He liked the straightforward reinforcement stuff, and he worked with scheduled reinforcement and so on. And so all that other stuff was put aside. And one of the things that was said in those days was, well, you never learn anything new with classical conditioning. And what they meant was, you start out with an unconditioned stimulus, let's say food, and an unconditioned response to that, which let's say salivation, if you want to go back to the original Pavlovian experiment. And what you do is you pair a bell just before the food, and pretty soon you find that you've got a new control over the salivation, which is the bell. The bell precedes the food, and the dog starts going. Anybody that has a dog knows the dog starts salivating. But people say, well, yes, but you didn't learn anything new. The dog didn't learn anything new. It's still just a dog that salivates. It didn't learn, to recite poetry or anything. It's still just a dog that salivates. Now you can go on and not use a bell, and you can use a light, or you can use a sound of some other kind than a bell, and you can get control over salivation again in some other way, but it's still just salivation. So all of that was kind of put aside for what was called, I think, in the short run of the early 60s, behavior modification. And people didn't like that term because it got a bad rap with a couple of events, one of which was Clockwork Orange, which is a movie that looked into counter conditioning of a kind of a weird sort that the people in Hollywood dreamed up, which wasn't very accurate. But nevertheless, it presented classical conditioning as a really bad thing. You could classically condition people, and you could get into their mind, whatever that happens to be, and make them think things they wouldn't have otherwise thought, and so on. The field has always liked this notion. It's always had a sort of side romance with the notion that you could control other people. And what they meant by that was control their mind, and they weren't sure about what they meant by that last word. But it wasn't just control of behavior, it was control of the mind. And that's what Clockwork Orange sort of said could happen. And it kept everybody busy. But the way that managed to make behavior analysis bloom was that it set aside, in some sense, all the classical conditioning stuff, which is kind of too bad. There's a lot of good stuff in there. We could talk a long time about that. But that was sort of put aside. And Skinner stepped forward and led the ball game. He and Fred Keller, another big name in that area, Martin Seligman, a lot of famous people that came along and said, and we're on the vanguard, Dippenlot, we're on the vanguard of calling it behavior analysis. And it wasn't until I was practically retired, I think, when behavior analysis became the new buzzword for what we do. Yeah.
Speaking of being retired, you're Professor Emeritus from the University of Maryland.
Yeah.
You do a column for a newspaper, you did radio talk shows, you do parent education. Is there anything in your career that you think you might have done differently, or to have it to do over you would? You've done so much.
No, well, I don't know if I've done so much. I probably should have, I might have stayed less in animal work. I stayed in animal work until the 70s. And that may have been too long. The reason I did was because that's where the money was. And it was hard to get grants of the nature that I needed to support a whole laboratory of people by trying to do something which in those days I probably would have called clinical. So I stayed with the animal work a long time, but I started moving over, and I look back on it, I can see it, but I couldn't see it then. The last 6 or 8 years that I was in animal work, I worked almost entirely with dogs, training them for the Army. And it was an operant procedure, it was a behavior analysis procedure, but it was a very applied one. I wasn't worried about why the dog did it or whether we could help the dog be happier or anything. I was worried about how to make the dog do exactly what we wanted him to do when we sent him to Vietnam to help the soldiers find people before they were shot, before the soldiers were shot. And that was, I'm just saying that because it was a very practical thing that we were after. We weren't trying to explain anything. And it worked very well, but it gave me the notion that, again, that you could take those kinds of principles and you could apply them to problems of other organisms. And of course, because of Don Pomeroy and people like him, they kept bringing up these examples that had to do with people. And so that's how I got into that.
And speaking of people, what areas of the field of behavior analysis would you like to see more work in? Currently, we know behavior analysis is used in special education, disorders of the mind, but you've done, and your colleagues you've mentioned have done work with people. So where would you like to see more work done?
Schools.
Schools.
I think it's too bad that we do school. I'll probably make a lot of enemies saying this, but it's too bad we run the schools the way we do. I'm not sure where to start on the job, but there needs to be a and I'll use my terms for it, and people won't like it probably, but there needs to be an emphasis on the behavior that the kids are supposed to learn. And one thing we're trying in a couple of places is when you have a school conference and the teacher is going to have a conference with the parents. A couple of programs that I've gotten interested in starting, first thing we do is have the student come in and present what he or she has been doing. And so that they have to do something like we're doing here. They have to, except maybe with a little slideshow on the side, they have to show their paperwork and explain what it is, and some of the paperwork that they didn't have done, and the tests that they took that they didn't get right, and why they're going to have it better next time. And so they get to have a 15, 20 minutes blurb. And it's a golden thing. You can still have a regular parent-teacher conference, excuse the kid later, and parents can have their questions in private if they want to. But this part occurs. And the reason I think that's a good example is because it says, all right, we're going to have the kid do something. And there's going to be a lot of kudos given for that. The parent is going to have to come up with some, gee, that was good, I didn't know about that, and so forth. And I know you had a problem with that part of it. And how can we help? There's going to be a lot of give and take with the parent, which is an important part of it, of course, and the teacher. And so it's going to be focused on the behavior of this child, that they didn't get this right, but they got that right, and so forth. We don't often do all of that. One of the problems I have with it is that sometimes in the school system, they'll try to use consequences, but they don't use positive consequences. They use, pretty much negative consequences. And so they send the kid home. They suspend the kid from school because he had bad behavior. I've even had teachers tell me that. They suspended the child for bad behavior. Well, where did the kid go? He went home to watch television. How does that help? And he said, well, but he knows. I say, I don't like that word. What he knows is not terribly important. Where he is important, and what he's doing is terribly important. What's he doing? watching television. He has to go back to school on Monday. And it seems to me we've got the principles wrong there. And that would be fun to do something about that.
Well, that would take us to our next question. What would you like to see as the future of behavior analysis? Keeping in mind, though, to get more work done, we need money and grants to do it. So,
and we don't have any.
And we don't have any.
Yeah, right.
In a perfect world, what would you like to see?
A perfect world with a lot of money. I would like to see the kids that are in the schools get promoted by grades, of course, but through the grades. But I'd like to see them get promoted to be teachers. And I started out years ago with a program that aimed at doing that, which essentially is to have the kids that are in the high school tutor the kids that are in the middle school. The kids that are in the middle school teach. Anybody who's been a teacher knows that the way you learn how to be what you are is because you had to teach it. It wasn't until I went to graduate school and somebody said, by the way, and this was the first day, by the way, you are teaching a discussion section in Psych 100. That's your job. And I said, wait. And so I went home and got the textbook. I didn't have that textbook. Went home and got that textbook, Don Lewis's book, to get ready for Monday, because I was going to have to stand on the other side of the desk in the front and look like I knew what I was doing. And that's where you get it. So anyway, I'm going off a little bit, but having the kids be tutors really helps. And we ran a program for a while in Columbia, Maryland, where I was. My wife and I ran it. We brought the kids down from the high school to teach the other kids. And Carol, my wife then, was right. And that she went up to the high school and had a big argument with the principal, because the principal wanted to give us the really bright kids. You want to tutor math? Take my bright kids down there and let them tutor the kids in math. And Carol, my wife, said, no, we'll take the ones below the center. She wanted to take essentially D students into this program. Paying $5 an hour, so it's big binky. And she turned down the kids that were really bright and take the other. And the reason was, and she was absolutely right, I think, was that the learning that goes on in that situation is more than one way. The kid gets tutored, yes, true. That's what the middle schooler gets. The high schooler learns the stuff again and learns it much better because he does the tutoring. And he's getting paid, yes, that's maybe one reason he's doing it, but he has to learn it. He's on the block as a teacher. So by the time you get to the senior year, it's too bad that when you get to the senior year, they don't do that anymore. And that's too bad, because that's what they need to be able to do. That's how they learn. That's how they learn. That's how I learned. I mean, maybe that's making it too narrow, but I learned because I was forced to teach all the way through graduate school. That's the only way I could make enough money to live on was to teach. And it was the teaching, I didn't realize this at first, but it was the teaching that made me learn that stuff as well as I needed to know it. I didn't get it from the classes. I mean, I got enough to get by, but I got it when I took it out of the class and went over and tried to tell somebody else about it. Yeah, that's what needs to be done.
I do have a question, a message I want you to send out, but before I do, I want to get back to a previous question.
Okay.
You've done a lot in the world of psychology and behavior analysis, and I know you helped many students obtain their PhD by sitting on their committees and teaching a lot.
That's true, I have.
Of all your contributions, what would you say you would like to be remembered for? And I know you're modest, but let's just come up with something, okay?
I keep a list of the graduate students that I have had. I have a list of the ones where I was the major professor, and they were a lot of them were doctors, but there were master's students that I was their mentor. And I keep a list of the graduate students for whom I was just a member of the committee. I have that list going back, I think my first one would have been 1962, so 46, 7 years. And that's probably the only way that I get remembered. You know, because I meet one of those people now and then. You know, and several of them now are now retired. Shows you how old I am. But you know, they've gone through their career and they're now retired, and they're getting asked these questions. They're probably answering them somewhere else in the building. And that's the legacy, because you know we're not going to make it unless some other bigger group goes forward and takes this stuff and applies it. But it will win. I think one of the questions that was on here that when I was looking at it before we started about the future of behavior analysis, you know, as if maybe there's not going to be one. Well, there's going to be one because it's right. It's right. What goes on out in this building today has to do with behavioral principles. That's what's happening. When you go down the hallway and some people talking to other people, listen for that. That's what's going on. It's behavioral stuff. So it's not a matter of whether we're going to win or not. It's the way the world is. We may have a tough time getting there because there are people that don't like to think about it that way, and wish that there was a magical way that a psychiatrist or somebody could say something to a patient and then they flip over and get all better. But it doesn't happen. And in the cases where it's been asserted that it happens, I would say, well, you know, if you looked at the whole background of that event, you would find the behavioral principles operating there. And so I think that's what the future of it is. It's these people going out, and this will go forward. I have no problem with trying to win a battle against cognitive something or other. I don't really think about it that way. I have cognitive events. I know I do anyway. And so I suppose that someday we'll figure out something about those. So it's not a matter of beating them. It's a matter of just our own field being more understood and explained by us, and more understood by us. And that's what we'll do in the end. What's the message?
On a closing note, what message would you like to send to students of the future?
I don't know, except to say that, you know, I would like for them to do a lot of applied work where we need it most, which seems to me to be in education. And you know, you look at these stories you get in the newspapers these days, you know, Iraq or Iran or someplace. And I heard an interview of a guy that studies the Iraqi educational system, an American that studies the Iraqi educational system. And God, there's a lot of work to do, because what he described, I thought, was more like a Sunday school than an elementary school. It was about that faith and stuff, you know. And I understand the importance of that, but that's not what will move an economy forward. That's not what will move a nation forward. So, you know, that's the message that would be important to send. Is say, look, you know, let's take the children that you, and I guess not right now, I'm thinking of the parents and teachers of those kids in Iraq or Iran or someplace like that. So let's take those kids and let's teach them something. Okay, not some thought or something that was written in the Bible or somewhere else. Not to disparage that, but only to say that, you know, what's practical for them to know to survive out here in this world that we seem to be creating is for them to know about how to use behavioral principles. And, you know, you're going to use them with your spouse, you're going to use them with your own children. Even if you don't call them by the same words that we call them, you're going to do it. Your kid, you're going to have a kid, and when that kid comes in, the kid's going to do something, and when he does something, you're going to do something back. And you sure all know a lot about that.
We are done. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. McIntire.